my work as an author, I traffic in fiction. I do not traffic in lies. Although I'll admit that the distinction is a nice one and perhaps not easy for the layman to make. With fiction, with art, with writing, it's important that even if you're dealing with areas of complete outrageous fantasy, that there is an emotional resonance. It is important that a story ring true upon a human level, even if it never happened. I got into the swing of my writing career in the very early 1980s, which was a very overcast time politically. Most of the liberal world was watching in horror at the inexorable rise of the Reagan-Thatcher right-wing fuck-buddy coalition. At the same time, we had elements of fascism starting to make themselves prevalent upon the streets of Britain with the rise of the National Front. And all in all, things were looking fairly bleak. I decided that if I wanted to write about this grim present, the best way to do it was in the form of a story set in the future, which is by no means a new trick. Most dystopian science fiction is not actually about the future, it is about the times in which it was written. And the script that I came up with, V for Vendetta, was no exception. This was set in what at the time seemed an unreachably distant period in the future, which was 1997, and Britain had been taken over by a coalition of fascist groups, with a very romantic anarchist adventurer set in opposition against that. To get over the idea of fascism, I needed some symbol that would convince the readers that they were looking at a fascist police state. The thing that I finally settled upon was the idea of security cameras mounted upon every street corner and watching every move. I figured, yeah, that looks pretty much like fascism in action, and the readers were equally impressed, apparently, so government figures who must have been reading it at that time and decided that security cameras at every street corner of the metropolis was indeed just what we needed for the late 1990s. On my 40th birthday, rather than merely bore my friends by having anything as mundane as a midlife crisis, I decided it might be more interesting to actually terrify them by going completely mad and declaring myself to be a magician. This had been something that had been coming for a while. It seemed to be a logical end step in my career as a writer, and the problem is that with magic, being in many respects a science of language, you have to be very careful what you say, because if you suddenly declare yourself to be a magician without any knowledge of what that entails, then one day you are likely to wake up and to discover that that is exactly what you are. There is some confusion as to what magic actually is. I think that this can be cleared up if you just look at the very earliest descriptions of magic. Magic, in its earliest form, is often referred to as the art. I believe that this is completely literal. I believe that magic is art, and that art, whether that be writing, music, sculpture, or any other form, is literally magic. Art is, like magic, the science of manipulating symbols, words or images, to achieve changes in consciousness. The very language of magic seems to be talking as much about writing or art as it is about supernatural events. A grimoire, for example, the Book of Spells, is simply a fancy way of saying grammar. Indeed, to cast a spell is simply to spell, to manipulate words, to change people's consciousness. And I believe that this is why an artist or writer is the closest thing in the contemporary world that you are likely to see to a shaman. I believe that all culture must have arisen from cult. Originally, all of the facets of our culture, whether they be in the arts or the sciences, were the province of the shaman. The fact that in present times this magical power has degenerated to the level of cheap entertainment and manipulation is, I think, a tragedy. At the moment, the people who are using shamanism and magic to shape our culture are advertisers. Rather than trying to wake people up, their shamanism is used as an opiate to tranquilize people, to make people more manipulable. Their magic box of television, and by their magic words, their jingles, can cause everybody in the country to be thinking the same words and have the same banal thoughts all at exactly the same moment. In all of magic, there is an incredibly large linguistic component. The bardic tradition of magic would place a bard as being much higher and more fearsome than a magician. A magician might curse you. That might make your hens lay funny, or you might have a child born with a club foot. If a bard were to place not a curse upon you, but a satire, then that could destroy you. If it was a clever satire, it might not just destroy you in the eyes of your associates. It would destroy you in the eyes of your family. It would destroy you in your own eyes. And if it was a finely worded and clever satire that might survive and be remembered for decades, even centuries, then years after you were dead, people still might be reading it and laughing at you and your wretchedness and your absurdity. Writers and people who had command of words were respected and feared as people who manipulated magic. In latter times, I think that artists and writers have allowed themselves to be sold down the river. They have accepted the prevailing belief that art and writing are merely forms of entertainment. They're not seen as transformative forces that can change a human being, that can change a society. They are seen as simple entertainment, things with which we can fill 20 minutes, half an hour while we're waiting to die. It is not the job of artists to give the audience what the audience want. If the audience knew what they needed, then they wouldn't be the audience. They would be the artists. It is the job of artists to give the audience what they need. My career as a magician continues to evolve. Since I, to a certain degree, believe art and magic to be interchangeable, it has seemed only natural that art should be the means by which I express magical ideas. Beautiful little psychedelic artifacts in their own right, which actually capture the kind of narrative journey that we've tried to take the readers on as part of these performances, to overwhelm the sensibilities of the audience, to tip them over into a kind of psychedelic state where we can hopefully actually change their consciousness and direct it to different places, different levels, hopefully into new and hopefully magical spaces. Much of magic, as I understand it, in the Western occult tradition, is the search for the self with a capital S. This is understood as being the great work, as being the gold that alchemists sought, as being the will, the soul, the thing that we have inside us that is behind the intellect, the body, the dreams, the inner dynamo of us, if you like. Now, this is the single most important thing that we can ever attain, the knowledge of our own self. The alchemists had two components to their philosophy. These were the principles of solve and coagula. Solve was basically the equivalent of analysis. It was taking things apart to see how they worked. Coagula was basically synthesis. It was trying to put the disassembled pieces back together so that they worked more efficiently. These are two very important principles which can be applied to almost anything in culture. There has recently, in literature for example, been a wave of postmodernism, deconstructionism. This is solve. Perhaps it is time in the arts for a little more coagula. Having deconstructed everything, perhaps we really should be starting to think about putting everything back together. In the mid-1980s, I was asked by an American legal institution known as the Christic Institute to compile a comic book which would detail the murky history of the CIA from the end of the Second World War to the present day, covering things such as the heroin smuggling during the Vietnam War, the cocaine smuggling during the war in Central America, the Kennedy assassination, and other highlights. What I learned during the frankly horrifying research that I had to slog through to accomplish this was that yes, there is a conspiracy. In fact, there are a great number of conspiracies that are all tripping each other up, and all of those conspiracies are run by paranoid fantasists and ham-fisted clowns. Originally, there was only one science of existence. Our entire worldview was magical. Everything we did, everything that happened in the world, had a kind of shamanic, magical significance. If you look at the very earliest cultures, some of whom are still extant upon the planet, the Aboriginal cultures, most of their languages only have one tense. Everything is subsumed within the present. They can talk about things that happened and things that haven't happened yet but will happen in the future, but they talk about them in the present tense. Now, if we're going to venture into this hypothetical and more or less entirely unknown territory, it would seem to only make sense that we should try and track down route maps that may have been made by previous explorers. Now, when you're talking about the territory of the mind and perhaps the spirit, the only route maps available are magic systems from antiquity. You're talking about systems like the Kabbalah, with its map of every conceivable human state. You're talking about systems like tarot, a pantheon of archetypal images that provide the cartography for a map of the human condition. Most people find the word apocalypse to be a terrifying concept. Checked in the dictionary, it means only revelation, although obviously it has also come to mean end of the world. As to what the end of the world means, I would say that that probably depends upon what we mean by world. I do not think that this means the planet or even the life forms upon the planet. I think the world is purely a construction of ideas, and not just the physical structures, but the mental and ideological structures that we've erected. That is what I would call the world. Our political structures, philosophical structures, ideological frameworks, economies, these are actually imaginary things. And yet, that is the framework that we have built our entire world upon. It strikes me that a strong enough wave of information could completely overturn and destroy all of that. A sudden realization that would change our entire perspective upon who we are and how we exist. History is a heat. It is the heat of accumulated information and accumulated complexity. As our culture progresses, we find that we gather more and more information, and that we slowly start to move almost from a fluid to a vaporous state as we approach the ultimate complexity of a social boiling point. I believe that our culture is turning to steam.